Hi, and welcome to The Valuation Metric, a podcast about the risks, rewards, roadblocks, and revelations, reshaping the way that we measure worth. I'm your host, Sara Gutterman, CEO of Green Builder Media, North America's leading media company focused on green building and sustainable living. Across our economy, a quiet truth is underway and happening and unfolding. The metrics that have guided decision-making for decades, first cost, price per square foot, short-term returns, are proving to be insufficient in a world that's now defined by climate risk, resource constraints, and rising expectations for performance. Nowhere is that misalignment more visible and perhaps detrimental than in housing, because homes aren't just financial assets. They're long-term systems that either protect or expose us physically, financially, and environmentally. And yet many of the most important dimensions of those systems, especially carbon, have largely remained invisible. But today's guest is helping to change that. Matthew Cooper is the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at PEG, a company that's at the forefront of energy modeling, performance validation, and building science. His work sits at the intersection of data, design, and decision-making, helping translate building performance and carbon into something that the market can understand, measure, and ultimately value. So today, we're going to explore what happens when we make the invisible visible and how that shift could fundamentally reshape the way that homes are designed, built, financed, and valued. Matthew, welcome to the Valuation Metric.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So before PEG became a leader in energy modeling and performance validation, there was you, your story, your motivation. What first woke you up to the idea that homes could and really must be something more than walls, wires, and a mortgage?
Well, what's interesting is kind of the path that I took to end up here working in residential new construction. My background was principally founded in commercial buildings and working in commercial and institutional buildings where there were much more robustly understood, designed, and implemented ways of evaluating the built environment. So, having standards and policies and practices already available to practitioners that are working in commercial buildings was something that I was very used to and came up through the mechanical engineering side of things, and then learned hands-on how to do air balancing and sound evaluations and vibration evaluations in buildings, and starting to look at really understanding the interaction between our workspace in most cases and the wellness of the people that are trying to function within those spaces. And we had a lot of standards that were available to us, such as air diffusion performance indexes and ways that we evaluated what made people productive and comfortable and happy in their workspace. And we started to work with people that wanted to apply some of those things to their own individual homes, and these were existing homes. So we started to adapt some of those practices to suit more closely the types of buildings that we would be working in that were residential. And over time, we developed the same perspective for looking at new construction. And in particular, production new construction, and not so much just existing homes. And that's really what kind of brought us there was, how do we take things that we've already decided and understood in the engineering world and in the property management world, make good sense of how to measure our environment, things like commissioning and retro commissioning and continuous commissioning, and understanding how light impacts people inside a space, and not just temperature and not just what a thermostat says, and really all of indoor air quality and indoor environmental quality. So looking at sound, looking at light, drafts, obviously, humidity and temperature, but then also, invisible things such as contaminants, et cetera. and really taking those and apply them to the residential space. And that's really what kind of drove and continues to drive our passion is how do we continue to learn from the commercial world and pull those things into the residential world, where, as we all found, during COVID, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, really changed our perspective of how important is it for us to be looking at more than just sticks and bricks and, what color paint is on the wall.
Given that, is there a central principle that you refuse to compromise on when it comes to how housing is designed, constructed, and valued?
I would say that probably that the closest thing to a central principle for me and for PEG is to not let the way things have always been done stand in the way of implementing a better process.
Let me ask you a little bit of an esoteric question. Do you believe that homes and buildings have a moral obligation to protect, to nurture, to reduce harm? And if so, where does that responsibility live?
Well, I think that when you look at homes in particular and buildings in general, the first perspective of what is the point of that structure is shelter. And so to me, I feel that if you approach how you design, build, and live in any building, but in particular a home, if our first focus is on the fact that it is to provide shelter, then I believe that shelter encompasses wellness of the occupants and how the building interacts with its surroundings. And I believe that from a moral perspective, if we consider shelter first and everything else secondary, then that does become a moral perspective that needs to be considered primary and not a secondary.
Let's pivot a little bit and talk about rethinking risk and value. If you could wave a wand and rewrite one rule of valuation, one change that would unlock higher performance, climate responsive, healthier homes and buildings at scale, what would that be?
Well, I think back again to not letting the way that we've always done things be the first driver. So when we find success working with different categories of customers, we look at finding what element of the way that they've always done things is really providing no value to them, and then it's actually detrimental to what they're trying to accomplish. And when I say that, we have customers all across the spectrum, people that are building just production homes, that they're entry level homes, all the way up to people building very complex and costly custom homes, to working with workforce housing, to looking at school housing. There's so many different parts of the industry that we touch, that taking that perspective to each of them of we're going to find what part of how you've been doing is something that if you could pivot away from that and learn to do it a different way, you would have so much better of an end result for the constituency that is your customer base.
And when you have that conversation with your clients, whether it's the production builders or other stakeholders in the value chain, especially the stakeholders right now that are doing things in a more traditional manner, let's say to that price per square foot valuation metric, as opposed to the value per square foot valuation metric, how do they respond? Are they getting it? Are they responding well, or are they kind of sticking to the status quo?
It's interesting because it varies so much. When we first started working in the residential space, our principal relationship was between our third party experts and people that were in construction, people that were actually building the structures. And it became more of a relationship of understanding building science and how building materials need to effectively interact with each other, and how to start to make changes in even scopes of work for various trades, of changing what the expectation was for the end result, and how do you push that through the entire food chain of all the different moving compartments of how you build. And it started to shift over to, we started to have more relationships with the design side or the sales side or the procurement side. And since each of those constituencies within the building community have different motivators, you often have to find, how do you resonate what you're trying to provide to them in a manner that fits into the narrative of where they tend to focus. And then when you're really lucky, you start to find customers that have an ethos that is consistent throughout all of those different departments of their operation, that they've got a unifying need and perspective that aligns with very closely what we're trying to help them implement or perfect. And for us, those are the most rewarding customers to work with. But it's also equally rewarding to get to work with someone that started down here, and over years we've gotten them to up here, and they anticipated it being a painful process. And what we've been able to successfully accomplish over time was that they finally find themselves up here, and they didn't experience pain along the way. And that becomes kind of an aha moment for them of, you were right. We were capable of doing it better all along. We just didn't, we bought into the old mantra of, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way we're going to do it. And if you try to deviate from that, it's just going to fail, and it's going to be more expensive. And there's no way we'll be able to adequately repeat it in a manner that allows us to continue to grow as a business. So I think those are kind of the things that really become a sought after reward of all the different types of customers that we work with.
How do you think that we can be the most effective in terms of helping certain builders and other stakeholders that are perhaps pursuing a more traditional model understand that performance, resilience, health and wellness, energy independence, all these things we talk, decarbonization, are not cost centers, but revenue drivers and value drivers? What, in your experience, has been the most effective messaging and just approach when it comes to helping facilitate that transition?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are most effective in accomplishing that. The first is finding out, like I said, what is the perspective that they have that has become kind of a hallmark of how they do business, and then take that and use it as the opportunity to change the narrative. So if we come to meet with a builder, and as they said, all they're interested in is cost, then one, they may not be a good customer fit for us. But it's a challenge, and we like challenges. So if we come to working with someone and that's their sole focus, then we need to be able to take the conversation and shift it into helping them see how the changes that we're trying to help them accomplish are actually something that can have a positive impact to what at this point in time is most important to them, that being the cost of construction. So, for example, we may come to a customer and say, well, whether you're being mandated to change something, or you're seeing increased interest from your buying community in something that you're not currently doing, and all you're focusing on is how much more it's going to cost you, let's look at the total life cycle of what would happen if you made those changes. And the thing that's really cool about today is that we have such great modeling tools. We have such great, programs that we can use to visually and mathematically and from an accounting perspective, really show a builder how these changes can be cost effectively implemented into their process so that maybe there is a higher first cost to that particular part of construction. But if you look at the entire picture of how is it going to impact the cost of ownership? How is it going to impact the cost of operating the home? And how will that benefit the occupants of the home? And we look at, if we do these things and we do them properly, how will that actually reduce the builder's exposure to warranty expense? How will that actually boost the customer satisfaction of their pool of buyers, and how will that change the reputation for them as a business entity? And then if you consistently do that over time, where will you actually see the opportunity for making these improvements in what you're doing, whether it's materials or methods? How will that actually benefit you from a net cost perspective of operating your business? And I think that's the magic of the tools that we have available to us. And as we start to look at new things as they come along, getting those tools in place and being able to reliably implement them into that process is what becomes really critical in effectively carrying that narrative forward until you get to the point, Sarah, where something that you talked about, and you seemed like you were out on the fringe 15 years ago. Today, builders at every level may look at something and say, yeah, well, no kidding. We need to do water resistant barriers. We need to properly flash windows, or we need to shift away from this type of material that we use in a home, or we need to, invest in a better window. Whereas before, like I said, some of those things were, they were just, esoteric ideas out there for, a production level builder. And today they're just standard practice. So it's a constantly moving and improving, world that we live in with residential construction. And I think that story in and of itself becomes something that you can utilize when starting to now tackle the next thing, like embodied carbon, and say, well, remember when you said that was impossible, and look at where you are today. So trust me when I say that this is a new process. This is a new way of understanding the value per square foot of the home. But just remember that back in the day when you thought that just getting energy efficiency was going to be impossible for you, look at how far you've come, and look at how far your trades have come, and look at how much happier your homeowners are, and look at where it's actually become a profit center for you versus a cost obstruction.
Absolutely. We see the same thing. The conversation has evolved so much in the last couple of decades, but particularly even in the last 5-ish years with respect not just to building science and performance, but now we are having robust decarbonization conversations with builders and stakeholders of all kinds, which is actually a nice segue. I'd like to shift gears and talk about decarbonization. So for listeners who might not be familiar with the concept and the term, what is it and why does it matter?
So we've had for a while now in the residential new construction world, an understanding of the relationship between energy efficiency and operational carbon. So there's been from RESNET, there's been a carbon index available for many years now, which is a direct corollary to the energy efficiency of the home and the makeup of the grid where that home is built. So that part of carbon is kind of, it's been there. People are aware of it. Some people are utilizing it to drive change and to drive choices. When you look at things such as code cycles in states, as well as incentive programs from utility companies, or states that are looking at having a definitive plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that operational side of things has been around for a while. What is new for and again, this is, like I said at the beginning, taking something that's been in existence in the non-residential construction world and bringing it into it, is, that's the exciting part of something new for us. And so when we look at, you know, the operating cost of the home and how that, correlates to greenhouse gas reduction opportunities, now we're able to finally look at the embodied carbon. So, in the institutional world and the industrial world, embodied carbon has been something that has been well understood, able to be evaluated, assessed, and reported on, because of having EPDs for products in whatever industrial componentry that was being looked at. So to take that concept and move it into residential new construction has been a challenge, and that's something that has been, it's impeded us from being able to try to take the tools that we had available to us that were designed for evaluating embodied carbon in commercial applications. They really weren't that appropriate or that able to be smoothly implemented into assessing the same type of things, same conditions in residential new construction. So we've had to cobble together different tools out there as a practicing consultant to try to do that in the residential space. And so we finally have the RESNET 1550 standard that is making it possible to look at embodied carbon in a home, and to include the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, which was a big important component of it that is very complex. So now we have the ability to look at first day carbon. So we're looking at what was the greenhouse gas impact of everything that went into the keys being turned in the door the first day that the new homeowner walks into their home. And that carbon, it is what it is on day one. It's not going to get higher unless the homeowner starts to make changes and renovations and things like that. So now we have the ability to look at the first day embodied carbon, and then also look at the operational carbon, and really be able to see what is the total carbon picture of a structure, and be able to drive choices and change in how do we pick and choose ways that we can reduce the embodied carbon without increasing the operational carbon, and vice versa.
The way that I like to think about it is, decarbonization in the built environment is of paramount importance, just because it's such a conspicuously consumptive sector. If you think about, there's 40,000 products, just a tremendous amount of resource that goes into any home or building. That's, the typical American home, I think, is it has about 40,000 products that goes into it, and embodied carbon is comprised of all the emissions from the very first raw material that's extracted for the very first product that goes into that house, and all of those products. So it's, extraction, transportation, manufacturing, packaging, more transportation and installation, all the way up until the day that house, we'll just talk about houses right now, is occupied. And then operational carbon occurs, with respect to operating and the performance of the home. Most of it's the energy use of the home once that house is occupied. So that's the difference between embodied and operational carbon. I think that RESNET 1550 really feels like a turning point, because it begins to measure, as you said, the embodied carbon in the materials and the total environmental load that a home carries from day one. And it turns carbon into something that's abstract into something that is quantifiable and comparable and ultimately financeable. And once carbon becomes visible, so do kind of let's say the risks and rewards. So insurance risk, durability risk, resale risk, but also the rewards of decarbonization, or minimizing and then ultimately reducing or eliminating the carbon to become, let's say, regenerative or carbon positive, as we're starting to see with some materials as they're absorbing more carbon in their long-term life cycle than they're using during production. So I think that this RESNET 1550, again, it helps create something that is usable to change the valuation model. So talk a little bit about what 1550 actually measures. And I think that it is specifically applicable to single family and multifamily residential units.
Correct. Yes. And so the way the standard works is that there are decisions that have to be made in the use of it as a tool. And those decisions are based on available information. And that's the other exciting thing I think about this is that for the first time, having a standard in place and the forthcoming tools that will be available to implement it will now afford manufacturers of materials and products a means by which they can make choices too about what products and do they want to bring to market, and for what purpose. So where in the past, we've not had a lot of insight into the embodied carbon of a lot of the materials that go into a home. Now that there's a standard for how do you calculate that, how do you assess it, that will drive change in the manufacturing world to make choices about developing and bringing to market lower embodied carbon options, because there's a tool that people can use reliably to consider the value proposition to them of, do I use product A that has a higher embodied carbon, or do I use product B that has a lower embodied carbon? And ultimately, even how do I design my structures? And when I look at the choices of how to design something, I can overlay into the process of thought of how do I want to make a structure be more resilient to wind or rain or other natural factors, but also take into consideration the impact that has on the total embodied carbon as well as the total, or as well as the operational carbon. Those are things that haven't been able to be done before. So it's exciting to see that change will be able to be enhanced as we go along with this new standard. But the way that the standard works is when the assessor is looking at each componentry, let's just think, for example, of one section of wall. If there are specific products being used or are being considered to be used in the construction of that wall, and those manufacturers have EPDs available on the marketplace for that product, then the assessor can use those EPDs. But since the challenge is that there are certain parts of construction that already have a lot of EPDs available. Some things such as windows and things such as roofing materials, things that are very heat intensive in their manufacturing, have traditionally been more inclined to already have done and invested in having those EPDs done. So where we have those actual EPDs, the assessor can use those. But what's really fascinating and fantastic about 1550 is where you don't have EPDs, now we have tables that have averages that are industry averages that are recognized and accepted industry averages for those same products. So even if we don't have an EPD for a particular product, the assessor can still calculate the embodied carbon by the use of these tables. And I think that will also become a driver for manufacturers, is if they know that they have a product that offers a lower operational or lower embodied carbon EPD value than what the table has as an average, then that becomes a selling point for them to be able to say, well, if you don't want to go with the average that's in table 27 of the standard 1550, our product is 10% lower than the average of those products, and that becomes part of a value proposition story. So taking in that wall, the dimensions of the wall, the amount of the materials that are in the wall based on the design, and being able to use either actual EPDs or the tables of average industry values for those products, we can create and come up with a total embodied carbon number for that section of wall. And essentially, in the implementation of 1550, we go throughout the entire home doing that. So it's every floor, wall, every component that goes into the home that has an embodied carbon element to it can be calculated, and you can end up with a final total calculation. And that then can be used to draw out choices. So if a builder is looking at either, it's important to them to start to reduce embodied carbon, they can make choices based on that. Or if they're building in a municipality that has a mandate or a requirement or a proffer that potential builders must demonstrate a prescribed amount of reduction, which we're starting to see in parts of the country. Now they have a way of creating that baseline and then making choices, and then refreshing that baseline with the new choices, and start to look and see where can I meet my goal, whether it's an internal goal or a prescribed goal of reducing embodied carbon, and how do I make those choices of what am I going to select differently in either my design or my selection of materials that accomplish that reduction that I'm looking to accomplish.
You talked a little bit about some of the benefits, certainly to an assessor having a tool that is kind of credible and replicable. But let's extend the value proposition. How do you see RESNET 1550 being deployed into the marketplace in terms of providing enhanced value to builders, ultimately to homeowners? But you talked also about municipalities starting to pick up this standard as the basis for codes and mandates and regulations. Also talk about that with respect to how that shifts and transform the market, so that this isn't something that is a voluntary thing, but ultimately this becomes something that is required for builders and developers throughout the country.
Yeah, well, I think again, so if you look at the drivers, you have, for example, in the Northeast U.S., you have mandates for using an optional path of calculating and demonstrating reduced embodied carbon can impact both code compliance as well as financial incentives from the municipality or from the state to developers and builders. So that becomes a tool of, just as they learned in energy efficiency of getting away from prescriptive construction and utilizing performance approach through modeling tools to make choices of complying with code, but in a more strategic thought process that allowed them to demonstrate that compliance through the use of better performance versus just following a prescriptive checklist. So the same thing can apply here in that type of market. What's interesting is that we also have very unique styles of construction that are different across the country. So, for example, there was a 100 home study done by the Northeast HERS Alliance in Massachusetts, looking at 100 homes. These were homes that had been built in the last year to several years that had a HERS rating done, and those HERS raters were involved in the program to go back to those homes, not physically, but go back to those homes in their models and in their plans and specifications, and implement this 1550 process and develop a embodied carbon illustration of those same homes. And what's interesting is that in that marketplace, there's a prevalence of homes to be built with basements. So when we look at embodied carbon, obviously concrete is one of the major components that represent a lion's share of the embodied carbon in a home. And so you've got choices of, you could have the same square foot home without a basement and significantly reduce your embodied carbon as a choice from a design perspective. Or you could, if you believe that your buyer is simply not going to even come and look at a home that doesn't have a basement because that's what's most common in that marketplace, then you make choices of, well, what type of concrete do we use? And, can we go from a zero fly ash concrete to a 20% fly ash concrete or a 40% fly ash concrete and, offer the same product that the consumer wants, but at a reduced embodied carbon perspective. So, we see different parts of the country have different opportunities for us to tell this story and to look at how can we extract the most benefit out of it for both the product and the people that will live in those homes, and make those choices.
What are the biggest hurdles to integrating embodied carbon into how we value homes? What's the linchpin and what has to happen to move this from being an emerging concept to a market standard?
Well, I think what has to happen is people have to see and be able to rely upon the utilization of the standard, and you'll start to see more manufacturers understand that now they have a reliable methodology by which their products can be judged against their competitors. So there will start to be a change in the marketplace side of it. And that will start to change the awareness side of it within the consumer. So as consumers start to see more products on their marketplace that are visibly telling their embodied carbon story, they'll start to say, "What is that? And why is that important to me?" And then they may start to see, "Oh, well, now I understand what you're saying, why you're marketing your product as being a differentiator when it comes to embodied carbon." So I think those two components will start to be the key drivers: is manufacturers telling their story and consumers starting to see that story be told, start to understand it, and then start to ask for it. So being part of the valuation will start to impact things such as insurance requirements. It will start to impact things such as finance availability, because there will be tools on our marketplace that will say, okay, well, now there's a reasonable way of assessing this, whereas before it was very clunky, very complicated, and in a lot of cases, I think people would say, can we really trust that? Well, now that there's a methodology to do that, that will be rolled into the quality assurance part of RESNET, there'll be a change in that understanding and conversation around embodied carbon. And I think that because of the way that the consumer has seen energy efficiency become just such a standard component of what they look at when they consider, where do I want to live? I think that it'll be a faster adoption process for embodied carbon because it's following the same path of energy efficiency. And where energy efficiency in the 70s was very fringe, and it challenged a lot of people's perspective of is this important to me and why, to something where in the last decade to 15 years it's become just pure mainstream. Everybody understands it. Everybody asks about it. They want to know their HERS index on their home. They want to understand. They see the value proposition of codes changing. They see the benefits to them of improved indoor air quality, improved durability, improved retention of value. The value of their homes. I think I read recently the average age of American housing is 40 plus years old. So when you look at what does a 40-year-old home today need to bring it up to today's standards, it's significant. So people can make a choice of, when I'm looking at two homes to buy, one is 40 years old and one is brand new, the brand new home with better operational carbon, better embodied carbon is not going to need all these changes to bring it up to the same level of quality and comfort and shelter that I want for my family, and that will change their decision making.
Matthew, I have two final rapid fire questions. First, in a very succinct way, tell us what value per square foot means to you.
So to me, value per square foot is it's inclusive of quality of life. And to me, when I look at how do we help builders build homes that are a better home for their consumer, we need to look at every element of the home, and it has to be cohesive. So to me, the value is understanding and not being willing to consider taking the cheap route on one component of shelter, and just because of the first cost, that we have to consider all of these elements in consistent way and cohesive way, that they're all equally valued.
And if listeners could remember only one idea from you today, one seed that might change the way that they value the world around them, what would it be?
The best way that they can value the world around them is to see that this piece of shelter is something that should serve them and their family for decades to come, and to make that first choice based on working with developers that work with the types of products and the type of passion for delivering a home that serves them from a moral perspective, that values their entire life and their interaction with that structure. That's what they should be focusing on, is not just first cost, but looking at long term, what is the value proposition for me and my family.
Matthew, thank you so much. Your work has shown us that for too long, carbon and the risks that it represents has been invisible in housing, and that's just not okay anymore. But fortunately, tools like RESNET 1550 are bringing clarity to embodied and operational impacts, and the industry is gaining something that it has never had before, a tool to measure this type of decarbonization and tie performance to value. So thank you so much for joining us on the valuation metric. Let's keep measuring what truly matters.
Before you click away, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast wherever you listen. And don't miss the daily coverage on sustainability, housing, and what's next for home building at greenbuildermedia.com. Stay informed, stay ahead.